Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Yulia Joja. I'm with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington Universities, and I'm joined by my colleague Dalibor Rohaj, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Our special guest today is Edward Lucas, Senior Fellow at SIPA. More on that in a second, but until then, our podcast is dedicated to security, politics, and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. So let us start with our first segment, the news from the Eastern Front. And because we deal with the Eastern Front, but in a transatlantic manner, as per usual, we have bits and pieces that we want to talk about. We'll start small-ish, close to the front with Slovakia, and then we'll broaden it up to talk a little bit about the ongoing fights and conversations that we're having transatlantically. So, Dalibor, you are the ultimate representative of Slovakia here, at least in terms of analysis. So tell us what is going on with the Prime Minister, Robert Fico, his anti-Ukraine work, and what is going on with Slovakia overall.
Thank you, Julia. I always feel a little bad for steering the conversation towards my home country, but I can't really help being a little parochial. I was prompted to do this yesterday. We hosted a former Prime Minister of Slovakia at AEI for a private conversation. I'm afraid I can't really say more about who it was and what was being said. It was a very interesting conversation about the past and the present of the country. And there have been also a few sort of snippets of news out there that I think are worth reflecting on. So our listeners might remember that Slovakia did not take part in the Czech-led munitions initiative for Ukraine. However, Slovaks crowdfunded over 4 million euros to purchase munitions on the open market, and some of those munitions have now been making their way into Ukraine. So I think that's an encouraging piece of news. Moreover, contrary to the promise made by Fico's party in the run-up to the election last year, Slovakia continues to export defense articles, most importantly munitions, to Ukraine based on private contracts. So this would not be assistance, but this would be stuff that's paid for by NATO through European Peace Facility, whatever schemes there are that pay for these private contracts, this stuff gets exported. In fact, the sort of pace at which stuff is being sent out to Ukraine has accelerated somewhat during the first year of Fico's government. So over 100 million worth of munitions and other defense articles have been sent over to Ukraine. And it's kind of funny to watch this fact reverberate through the political system, because in a way it sort of puts opposition in a bind. They, on the one hand, are pro-Ukrainian and are happy about this development. It would be much worse if Slovakia had reneged on some of these private contracts, if these munition factories were just sitting there idly. But they don't really know how to respond to it. So they're sort of accusing the government of hypocrisy, and they're trying to sort of bang the hypocrisy charge over the head of the government. There is also this question of, given Slovakia is a small country and has a corruption problem, whether people close to the defense minister are not going to benefit and reap these massive profits from these contracts. To me, it would have been much more astute if the opposition simply went out of their way to praise the government for doing it, saying how happy they are that Fico is recognizing the importance of building Slovakia's defense industrial base and helping Ukraine. But for some reason, they're not doing that. I think this would be a much more effective form of sort of trolling, and it would be substantively correct to, lavish the government with praise for doing this, even though it means, enriching a few sort of politically well-connected people who are in this industry. But if I may just add one thing that's unrelated to munitions, it is interesting to me that the Slovak government has been kind of triangulating on this issue of Ukraine at large. So Fico said this weekend on one of the Sunday shows that he was adamantly opposed to Ukraine's NATO membership and that it would not happen under his watch. At the same time, the Slovak government and the Ukrainian government held a joint cabinet session, which is something they've been doing on a regular basis earlier this week. And Fico is simultaneously trying to portray Slovakia as the biggest advocate of Ukraine's EU membership. I don't know how he can square that in his head, how his voters can square that in his head, but he is kind of trying to have it both ways.
Does that mean that he's taking it up with the Hungarians? Because they seem to be the number one obstacle towards Ukraine's EU membership, and they seem to be besties, the Slovaks and the Hungarians at the moment.
I don't think we've come to a point when sort of actual decisions would have to be made, and there'll be plenty of sort of like veto points at which somebody can derail Ukraine's accession in these negotiations. But thus far, I mean, rhetorically, Fico has kind of like embraced this idea of Ukraine's EU membership, whether that's just rhetoric or whether that's meaningful. It is possible that Slovakia will just sort of stay out of the way, right? And that it won't be the country to sort of veto, the closing of a chapter in those negotiations. There are, 35, I think, chapters that need to be sort of completed. And at every stage, all the member states have to sort of sign off on that.
So, how does that then connect with Slovakia's need for Russian gas and that big dispute that has been going on for weeks now, but is certainly taking on heat over the last few days? In my understanding, Slovakia is very dependent on Russian gas, and Ukraine is saying we have no reason to prolong the contract through which Russian gas is flowing through Ukraine into Slovakia.
So I can say that this is a subject that we sort of discussed yesterday at our lunch with a former prime minister. And I'm not sure if there was sort of emerging consensus, but I think a couple of things are kind of relevant. One is that Slovakia pretends to be dependent on Russian gas, but there have been plenty of interconnections built between Slovakia and neighboring countries. If there were political will and willingness sort of to incur the higher costs of buying gas from elsewhere, Slovaks could do it. They just decided not to do it throughout the duration of this war.
So they would be fine if Ukraine cancels the contract.
It's a small economy. They can buy LNG from somewhere else. I mean, there are plenty of LNG terminals, and the sort of transport grid is connected. What is more difficult in the short term is kind of like oil refineries. So there's one in Slovakia that's sort of geared towards processing crude Russian oil, which is in some ways different from other oil. But again, like it's been 2 years into the war, and they've done zip in trying to switch to processing other types of oil. And so to me, it's like a sort of problem for a private company, not for the economy as a whole. And also from the Ukrainian perspective, we've been at these junctures before. I mean, the Ukrainians just make money on transit, and they sort of fudged it legally in the past, right? Like by sort of relabeling the gas as no longer being Russian gas, but being owned by the recipient country. And so then they'll be sort of transporting, Hungarian or Slovak gas instead of Russian gas. I'm not sure if this current iteration of this dispute is different or the same. I mean, this might sound horrible, but I wish somebody just like blew up that pipeline and we wouldn't have to talk about it anymore, and nobody, and the Russians would just not have that stream of revenue. I'm saying it half in jest, but there's sort of like semi sort of serious idea there that we could sort of, commit ourselves not to buying Russian natural gas by basically destroying the infrastructure the way it was done with Nord Stream.
Yeah, it's interesting that we got to this point, and we want to broaden it transatlantically, but just to stay for one more second here, news has also surfaced that Hungary, because we keep mentioning it, has decided to block a big chunk of EU aid that was supposed to flow into Ukraine, specifically 35 billion euros, until US elections. Which, to me, this piece of news is maybe the worst of them all. Out of context, it just means nothing because Hungary kept vetoing support for Ukraine. But the fact that we have now the European Union and the biggest chunk of aid being paused until the elections in the United States, when this is a matter of European security, tells me that European politics are not in a great place, that Hungary does manage to keep the whole European Union hostage, and that Slovakia might be talking about support for Ukraine and others, but they're not standing in the way of Hungary. So that, I think, is a good way to kind of add from Central and Eastern Europe to this issue of the war and Western support for it.
Yeah, no, Hungary continues to be a problem. My wish is that more effort was spent on trying to work around Hungary rather than accommodate it, and especially with these aid packages packages. And you could easily sort of imagine some of this happening as kind of an enterprise that's happening outside of the community method, right? That you wouldn't have the European Council and the EU as a whole doing this, but rather that you would have a coalition of the willing doing it on a much faster and more flexible basis without having to, ask Viktor Orban for permission at every juncture. You can't really do it with enlargements because of the way the EU is set up, but I think much of the assistance and the sort of effective partnership that exists between the EU and Ukraine just has to work around these obstacles somehow.
Yeah. So that makes us broaden to kind of the second new segment, and now we're looking from Central and Eastern Europe globally onto it. We're recording this on October 8th. Yesterday was October 7th, 1 year of the conflict in the Middle East, and a lot of reckoning when it comes to Ukraine. The one thing that I have to keep reminding myself is that after October 7th, what this has meant for Ukraine has been the disappearance from page one, from the first page of the news for good. It hasn't come back, even in the context of the war becoming politicized due to J.D. Vance and Trump in the context of the election campaign here. But Dalibor, what does it mean broadly or more generally October 7th for our corner of the world, and of course for the eternal issue that we have on this podcast? Yes, it's the Eastern Front, but it is about Western values, isn't it?
It is. So we did an episode, regular listeners might remember, I'm not sure how many of them we have who sort of listen in religiously to everything we produce, but we did a big episode in the immediate aftermath of the attack on October 7, and I think we all sort of shared our horror at the news and also at the sort of resurgence of anti-Semitism in the West, which was already visible in the hours after the attack, quite shockingly. I think we sort of can look back and stand by all the content that we sort of produced back then. But to me, the big issue here, looking back at the past year in the Middle East, is the need to re-establish deterrence, and that's a trait that the Middle Eastern situation shares with the one in Eastern Europe and also in the Pacific. So in Eastern Europe, we kind of take it for granted that NATO's Article 5 security guarantees hold, and that Ukraine was attacked for not being part of NATO, for lacking that security umbrella. Now, Israel is in a situation in which it enjoys its special relationship with the United States, which is a form of a defense alliance. However, the United States over successive administrations have pursued contradictory and kind of muddled Middle East policy that in some ways elevated Iran as a negotiating partner, given it free reign in places like Syria and Lebanon. And it strikes me that a big part of the effort that the Israelis are embarked upon is kind of to establish deterrence on their own, to sort of inflict real pain on Iran and Iranian proxies, to make sure that Iran doesn't do this anymore. And I think it would be far easier for them, and maybe the humanitarian toll would be smaller, if the United States were more willing to lean in through hard power into the Middle Eastern problem. And there might be understandable reasons why the United States is not willing to do that, learning or over-learning the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan, but it just, I think, makes the job of the Israelis harder, and it also kind of makes it more difficult for the US to try to steer events. We might have our quibbles with the way Israelis are doing this or that, but if we are not willing to kind of step in and project hard power, we don't really get to have a say. And I think that lesson applies to Eastern Europe as well. I mean, the less we are able and willing to help Ukraine, I think the less of a say we have in the way Ukrainians are conducting the war, and all the sort of concerns about asymmetric nature of the war and potential for escalation. I think it sort of cuts exactly the opposite way, the way sort of the Jake Sullivans and others are thinking about it. Because the less we give Ukrainians the tools to sort of prevail on the battlefield through conventional means, the more they have to come up with new ways of inflicting pain on the Russians. And that might include striking 200 miles inside of Russia, or using proxies or sabotage sabotages or like things that Russians might not like. And finally, now I'll stop there, is that there is something to be said about the interconnected nature of all these threats, not just the axis of evil, if you will, the sort of cooperation that takes place between Iran and Russia and China, but also the sort of lessons that our allies and adversaries are drawing from the failure of deterrence in specific theaters. And I think the sooner our adversaries understand that it's just not worth messing with, be it Ukraine or Israel or Taiwan, the better. But I don't think we are anywhere near that point yet.
Yeah, doesn't it come down to the fact that we are slow in catching up with the message that we cannot separate in theaters the way we used to in World War I and World War II? It's the European theater, the Asian theater, etc., because that's not how the world works anymore, building onto Dalibor your interconnectedness, and that Taiwan, Israel, and Ukraine and different parts of the world are ends to the same means, whether it is about Western values or the attack of Western values, in making these countries, to some extent, Israel less, Taiwan and Ukraine more, proxies by our adversaries. It seems to me that it's not just that we are very slow in integrating the fact that we have interconnectedness, but also that as a consequence, we're not there in terms of defending the West, or as the Russians call it, and I'm going to quote it this time because it is so fitting here, and it is the collective West, right? Whether we're talking about Taiwan, Israel, or Ukraine, we're talking about the connected West. And when it comes to the connectedness, rhetorically, we're not positioning ourselves in defense of it. And hence, we cannot also then, in combination with hard power, we cannot exert deterrence. In this context, a bit twisted, but nevertheless, I find it telling French President Macron's comments pointing to Israel and saying, criticizing the Biden administration for sending aid to Gaza, but he points to, and for us it's particularly important here on the Eastern Front, double standards, right, that we've been seeing throughout. But these double standards have in commonality the administration's policy, because I cannot call it strategy, of leading by fears of escalation. And it seems to me that we're in this process of keeping our eyes deeply shut or trying desperately to look the other way when our adversaries, to not call them enemies, are attacking from all sides, probing exactly whether we're willing or not to defend ourselves. And in this context, two things that I think are worth mentioning here. The first is news from today, October 8th, quoted anonymous staffers of the Trump campaign saying that Trump has been talking multiple times, 7 I've seen, to President Putin ever since leaving the office. I guess it's legal, but I'm not sure how okay it is on any level. And I'm curious to see how this is going to go down with voters, whether this will make a difference and in what way. And then the second thing also from today is the head of MI5, McCallum, one of those rare statements that we see from intelligence services or heads of intelligence services from the West. But I thought the statement was very telling because he says that the UK is facing the most complex and interconnected threats that it has ever faced. Ever, as in also World War II context. And he also is asked about the nature of these threats, and it's radical Islamism, it's also radical far-right ideologies. But he says in the end, it is a dizzying range, quote, of beliefs and ideologies, end of quote, which we now know on the Eastern Front and beyond is, of course, also connected to Russia. By the way, Russia is in the headlines of this news on MI5 because we know they have been picking up sabotage and shadow operations across the continent over the past few months in the summer, and that they're threatening to pick up more if we are supporting more aid, including the long-range weapons into Russia for Ukraine. So if we're looking at this piece of news in terms of Russia and others building up attacks in the Middle East, in Europe, across the West and beyond, and on the other hand, we're looking into Russia, where I think Putin has recently signed in the law, or is going to sign the law, that gives prosecution immunity to those that have been fighting in the war, which is going to create endless demographics demographic issues in Russia. And of course, in the occupied Ukrainian territories, this is not going 2.5 years, almost 3 years into the war. This is not going well for the West. Attacks are just continuing again from several sides, and our willingness to defend and to deter whether these attacks come from Russia or not remains very, very limited politically.
So we'll hear more about the threats to the collective West, especially hybrid threats, in our second segment with Edward Lucas. But let me just answer very quickly your question about whether this news of Trump-Putin phone calls might make any difference in electoral politics. I'm deeply skeptical that it will, partly because the notion of some Trump-Russia nexus is just baked so deeply into the cake that I just can't see any voters being sort of moved by it in one way or another. After, the impeachment, after the Helsinki summit, after everything we've been through, people who don't like Trump probably understand that there is something dodgy going on, or at least a sort of sympathy that Putin has for the Russian dictator. And on the other hand, Trump supporters, I think, have kind of become inoculated against the Russia charge by just listening to it, all over again so many times with the impeachment, etc., etc. So I just think this is not one of the things that could sort of move the polls. Obviously, I'm not speaking as a political strategist. I know nothing about this stuff, but I would like to sort of meet the voter who looks at the headline and changes his mind about Trump one way or another.
We'll leave it at that because I don't disagree with you.
Let us now turn to our second segment and our special guest, Edward Lucas, who's a senior fellow at SIPA and former senior editor with The Economist, who covered Eastern Europe and has written about Russia and the former post-Soviet space, if you will, since the mid-1980s. He's the author of several books, including the very prescient New Cold War, published in 2008, The Snowden Operation, Cyberphobia, and Spycraft Rebooted. Ed, it's great to have you on the podcast. You've been writing quite extensively in recent years about Russia's so-called hybrid operations in Eastern Europe directed against NATO allies in Central and Eastern Europe, in the Baltic states. In a recent piece that you wrote for SIPA, you say that Russia has been testing deterrence in European and North American countries since the 1990s, invading neighboring countries, using cyber attacks, economic warfare, interference in political systems, arson, sabotage, murder. The list is long. Yet, when we look at the list of our responses to these acts of grey zone aggression, if you will, that list is very short. How do you explain that discrepancy?
I think there's a big difference in threat awareness. And the strange thing about these grey zone activities is that they really succeed not because Russia is 10 feet tall. The Russians are quite good at what they do, but in the end, these things succeed because we let them. And the grey zone attacks usually exploit a weakness in Western societies and Western systems and have an effect because of weak political willpower. And if we build resilience and redundancy into our system and have strong political willpower, then we can push back quite effectively. And in a way, the Baltic states are a good example of that, because we saw a lot of these techniques being used in the Baltic states in the 1990s. But the Baltic leadership was pretty tough, and they got Russian troops out, and they then were able to move ahead to get NATO and EU membership and built societies and systems which are among the most effective and secure in all of Europe.
So the Baltic states are interesting, partly because A, they are small, and B, because they have a very direct and immediate experience of what life under Russian domination looks like. Similarly, you have very often cited the example of Finland and other Nordic countries with the high levels of social capital, trust and cohesion as examples of resilience against hybrid aggression, if you will. The question for me, though, is whether any of those lessons from these countries are relevant for, our bitterly divided, rambling, pluralistic societies that seem to agree on little, and where in the United States we are heading into an election as polarized and as divided as we've ever been. So how do we stop Putin from exploiting these divisions?
First of all, I just have to pick you up on the idea that the first thing one says about the Baltic states is that they're small. They are small compared to Russia, but almost everywhere is small compared to Russia. They are are countries of 1, 2, 3 million people, but that's not unusual in Europe. We have lots of countries in the sort of 5 million and under. So I think it's important not to sort of start off by characterising them as somehow exceptionally small. I think the second thing is that they have also had to deal with polarisation and difficulty. They have a degree of linguistic polarisation because of the consequences of the Soviet occupation. There's been some quite sharp political polarisation over different issues at different times. And they have overcome these because they've managed to park national security outside the sort of politicised, partisan political spectrum. And I think that's entirely doable in other countries as well.
So when I was referring to the smallness of the Baltic countries, I didn't mean to diminish them in any sense. I was just making the argument that it might be easier to agree on some basics of national security in a sort of smaller and perhaps more cohesive society than it is in a large place like the United States. But the bigger question is, what, if anything, we should be doing in response to deter these Russian activities, whether on NATO's eastern flank or indeed in the United States?
The puzzling thing for me is that we know what to do, we just don't do it. The first thing is that we need a Russia policy, because the so-called grey zone attacks are an expression of the fact that Russia sees Western countries as an enemy, and we don't really know what we want with Russia. We want it to go away, but we don't have a proper long-term strategy for dealing with Russia or dealing with the Putin regime. The deterrence by denial is extremely effective. The Estonians have shown how to do this with their extremely strong redundancy in their digital networks. So there's really no point in trying to do a big cyber attack on Estonia now, because they've got so much backup. And once you make it clear that there's no point in doing something, then the other side doesn't do it. Nobody goes down to Fort Knox armed with a revolver and a lockpick and expects to be able to get in and steal the money. So if you look sufficiently daunting, that's a deterrent on its own. And there's plenty to do, and it would be good to do for other reasons. We need to look at social cohesion, the way in which different government silos should talk to each other, redundancy in our critical national infrastructure, better information sharing. All these things will make us more resilient and therefore make the potential gains for an adversary a lot less. But we also need deterrence by punishment. We need to make it absolutely clear, if you do something that hurts us, we will make you wish you hadn't done it. And I've written articles about this, including one called Getting to Ouch, because ouch is what you want in deterrence. And my view is that really nothing we've done since the beginning of these attacks on Western societies has ever produced much ouch in Russia. We've thrown out Russian diplomats. Well, that hurts their spy networks, but it doesn't change their political calculus. We've imposed sanctions, they get round that. We issue endless cross statements which just bounce off. So we need to rethink our toolkit in terms of providing some real ouch when the Russians do things. I think perhaps the only exception, and it's only a rumour this, but I believe it to be true, is that when the Russian cyber attack on the Keystone pipeline in the United States became clear, the United States apparently responded by taking down the power grid in Moscow for a brief period and saying to the Russians, did you notice that? Message received and understood, we hope. And that since then, I think Russian cyber attacks on America have basically stopped, or at least on American critical national infrastructure. Now, I can't prove that. That's what the rumour mill says, but that would be the sort of thing that would work.
So how do you explain the sort of lack of items on that escalatory ladder that could produce an ouch without, going all the way to a sort of kinetic response? The lack of imagination, or is it just very hard because of some objective reasons for democracies to devise answers that do inflict pain?
Well, I think there's several reasons. One is that it's difficult for democracies to do things that involve breaking the rules. We are rules-based societies, and grey zone attacks are effectively breaches of the rules and norms that govern civilized conduct. So if we have drones disabling a major international airport, it's quite hard for us to say, let's go and fly drones around Sheremetyevo or Domodedovo or some other Russian airport and disable that. It's not the way we think. And in a way, I think that's right. We don't want to respond to Putinism by Putinizing our own societies. So there are some things we just aren't going to do. We're not going to track down Westerners living in Russia and beat them up with hammers because Russia tracks down Russians living in Western society and attacks them with hammers. But there are other things we can do. We need to use our imagination. One thing is we can get the Ukrainians to do it. They are attacking deep inside Russia and they would have ways of doing things that we would find it difficult to do directly. Another is that we need to really think through what our target list is and have a clear idea of how we would respond and how we manage the escalation. Because I think the second big problem is not just our sort of tender consciences, but our very jangled nerves, that we are very worried that if we fight back against these attacks, that Russia will then do something that we really don't like. And so they might, for example, to take a hypothetical but quite plausible example, they could arm the Houthi rebels with hypersonic missiles, which could threaten American warships. And that would be an escalation on the Russian side, which would be extremely unwelcome for the United States and other allied navies. So there's a kind of nervousness about this. But of course, the nervousness means that the Russians and other adversaries are always on the front foot because they know we're scared and they know we're cautious, and they're neither scared nor cautious. And that means that this new normal is becoming increasingly entrenched.
To change the subject a little bit, how do you see the war in Ukraine ending? Do you see an outright Ukrainian victory in sight, Ukrainian defeat, or some mixture of territorial concessions and eventual NATO and EU membership for Ukraine? Or is it just impossible to tell from where you're sitting?
The Ukrainians still believe that they can win, and they are doing tremendous damage to Russian infrastructure, and they've had major victories against the Russian Navy. They're finding it very difficult to generate the level of forces that are needed for a real counteroffensive. And they have a lot of broken equipment that's been damaged in the battlefield. They need to repair that. There's problems with manpower. And they don't have an answer to Russian glide bombs and these sort of relentless barrages that are gradually pushing them back on the parts of the Eastern Front. The Kursk gambit has been successful in sort of political terms, but it hasn't made a big military difference. If the aim was to draw away Russian forces from the Pokrovsk offensive, that hasn't happened yet. So there's certainly some frustration and some worries on the Ukrainian side. I think that in the West, we've systematically underestimated Ukrainian resilience and Ukrainian ingenuity. And we underestimate Ukrainians' will to win because they know what happens if they don't. I think, therefore, that the chances of a complete Russian victory, where Russian tanks make it all the way to Kiev or beyond that to Lviv, that I think is unlikely, really unlikely. I think that there is a danger that Ukraine gets arm-twisted, perhaps under a future American presidency, into accepting some kind of demarcation along the current line of control in exchange for what will be dressed up as very strong security guarantees, perhaps the promise of speedy NATO membership. So security for territory would be the label on the bargain, or temporary, it'd be the sort of West German solution. West Germany got into NATO, although they never really, at the time, didn't recognise Soviet control of the so-called East Germany. The problem with that is I don't think the deal will stick. I don't think that the Russians will stop. There will be a pause, but they will come back for more. I don't think the security guarantees will be real. There will be tremendous dissatisfaction within Ukraine, so the sort of Ukraine will be weaker as more divided as a result, and so it'll be a mess. And it will basically vindicate Putin's decision to go to war, because he'll say, I went to war and I came away with something. So I worry that's possible. And if it does happen, it will put us into a more difficult situation. I still think there's also a chance that we'll see a serious reassessment in Russia about the wisdom of doing the war. And if they continue to suffer these losses, at some point they may decide we actually want an end to it as well. And then they will be bargaining perhaps less aggressively than they would if they feel that the West has pulled the rug out from under the Ukrainian authorities.
Finally, if I may, I'd like to ask one or two questions on the UK itself. Notwithstanding its exit from the European Union, the UK remains an important player in European security. How much damage, if any, do you think the Brexit negotiation and all the acrimony has done to British standing in Europe and its ability to influence events, say, in the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
I think there's several strands to this. One is that the way we did Brexit created the impression that we were kind of frivolous, crazy, unreliable country with a political system that wasn't working. And that gave a very bad impression. So from the Theresa May's bizarre decision that she was interpreting Brexit as a mandate to pull out of the single market and the customs union, then the whole sort of Boris Johnson era and all the shenanigans around that, and the threats of a no-deal exit, that did damage to our reputation. I think our effectiveness in terms of defence, security and intelligence is still considerable, and we are an important partner, and the other countries miss us. There's no doubt about that. They miss us in EU decision making, and this new government, for all its faults, is clearly not crazy and has a majority and can get things done. So I think we're moving into a much more stable pattern. I don't think that there's a big bang coming in terms of a big reset. I think we've still got to rebuild trust and cooperation, and there's plenty of small things that we will do that will keep us busy for 5 years. But in the end, this arrangement we have is clearly suboptimal, and even if you tinker with it, it's still not really what anybody voted for. It's not the sort of magical hard Brexit that was going to make Britain into a sort of offshore economic superpower, and people are very fed up, and they're going to get more fed up as the reality dawns of how many more things are going to be landing on us with customs checks and border controls and so on. So I think one can really say, watch this space. We're not digging the hole any deeper. We're perhaps beginning to climb out. It's also, I think, worth noting that Europe itself is in quite a mess. And if one wanted a really sort of fundamental deal, one would need strong leadership in France and Germany in order to put pressure on the Commission through the Council of Ministers to fix this. And I don't see that happening at the moment. France and Germany are in a terrible mess. And it's the odd position that perhaps the strongest big country leader in Europe at the moment is Giorgia Meloni from Italy, which was not what anyone was expecting a couple of years ago.
Edward, Lucas, thank you so much for this update.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your excellent questions.
And now we're turning to our third and final segment, which are our recommendations. And it's my turn this time, and this segues well also to Edward Lucas's segment, but also to the conclusions of our news analysis segment, and that is the future of the West. And I want to point to two articles, or a speech and an article, that have been published over the last week, but I find themselves interesting, but also the combination thereof. So the first one is Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, who got a prize from the Atlantic Council that was handed to her by Elon Musk. That was quite a political context too. Elon Musk, not known to be a big Ukraine fan, her known to be a champion of Ukraine. And her speech was titled, Why the West is Worth Defending. Just a couple of days later, we have a piece published by Joschka Fischer, the former leader and iconic leader of the Green Party in Germany. His title is Making Europe Weak Again. He's talking about immigration and the rise of the far right, undisputably. She, Giorgia Meloni, has been at least tried to be pushed, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so, into the corner of far right, but she is championing European values. And so that triggers a conversation that is always, for those of us Europeanists, we cannot live without it. It's always ongoing about navel gazing and the future and the past and the identity of Europe, if there is such a thing. But this discussion has been really amplified over the last few months in the context of the migration crisis in Europe, as well as, of course, the war in Ukraine, the two existential threats. And I don't think we've had such a deep discussion ever since Brexit. But this time it is being led in what some people, like our colleague Hans Konani, who published a piece in Foreign Affairs recently, is calling civilizational terms, and is pointing to the dangers of framing Europe in civilizational terms. I'm a lot more skeptical about that, and I don't think civilizational terms is constructive in this context. I think we should call it in value terms. And we can criticize Meloni perhaps for having not the perfect values and not being centrist enough for some people. And we can criticize Joschka Fischer for maybe being too left for a taste or too right for some people. But nevertheless, whether we're being forced to or by our own willingness, Giorgia Meloni seems to be more eager to do so than Joschka Fischer, we are forced by our adversaries to talk about Europe and the transatlantic space in value terms, because it is our values that are being attacked by our adversaries. And so we will have to see in the coming months, especially in the context of the US elections where Europe will drive itself to and whether it will position itself more in defense of European values, whatever that looks like, or it will just be drifting into wherever the United States is taking the battle for values or the absence thereof. But I think these two articles/speeches are telling of the mental processes that Europeans are going through in trying to survive value-wise and forge somewhat of a future for European security. So with this, we are wrapping up our podcast for today. Thank you for listening to The Eastern Front, a podcast on security, politics, and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, aai.org, where you can also subscribe to receive our newsletter. We're also on X, LinkedIn, and other social media platforms. Please don't be strangers and send us your tips for future guests and topics that you'd like us to include. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get them. Thank you, and until next time, goodbye.